in our class. I'm going to be drinking water a lot. I've had persistent allergies for at least 6 months now, and it's like all right here. And it doesn't. It's driving me insane. It's one of those, it's like a Chinese torture test. It's so annoying. Maybe one of these days my allergies will go away, but I have never had allergies in the wintertime, ever, until this year. 2021. So anyway, that's besides the point. We are talking about how we really exist in the culture that's changing so rapidly around us. We have a culture that I think is really, I don't want to say frightening, but sometimes it's frightening. The things that we accept, the things that we reject. We talked on Wednesday evening Bible study. We talked about some of the gaps between genders, or not genders, between ages. We talked about how the younger people are growing up in a digital age. That's all they know. And then people who are in like their mid-20s and up kind of had their foot in both doors. They mostly grew up in a digital era, but they had some exposure to not. If you think about it, 10 years ago we had the slide out flip phones that had the little keyboard. You remember that? And you still have one of those? Yeah. I remember them. They were like that was the thing 10 years ago. Like people they'd slide the little keypad out and and so that was only a decade ago if you really think about that. So people my age grew up in mostly an analog. We were raised in an analog environment. I used to carry one of those VHS cameras on my shoulder. Remember the big honking VHS tape? And they'd make this grinding noise, and then you'd have to bang the side of it to get it going again. As a kid, I had that camcorder on my shoulder. And then of course the older generation, you guys grew up in an all analog home. And so now, with the introduction of technology, it's just a struggle, right? And it's annoying, Stone. You didn't hear that, did you, Betty? DP's picking on you. Stay in your box, DP. So, we talked about that on Wednesday, how, there's this disconnect between these groups. And so we have to figure out how to make that work. And, yesterday, Natalie and I were at a restaurant. We went out to eat. And we saw this family. And Natalie said, this family behind you, their kids are on their iPads. And they're watching a movie with earphones as they're eating food. But that's right. Yeah. They're sitting, two kids on each side of the table. And they're not even aware that the other kid is across the table. Brothers, they don't even know that the other one is across the table. And they're probably 5, 6 years old.
You don't take them to a restaurant and carry their iPads in.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Well, then there were a couple families that got out. And Natalie said, there's a kid with a cell phone, with a smartphone. Some of them had iPhones, and they're walking by. These little kids, like Isaac's age. Isaac's 5. And just one after the other. We see these kids just glued to their phones. And so there's this big disconnect, right? And we're growing up in this increasingly digital age. And, I've talked about this a little bit before, but I have some friends in ministry that they say because we're in such a digital age, we need to integrate that into worship. And so they're like, I've seen formulas where they say, something like 20% of your sermon should include video clips, and they have like this formula that they're preaching from, and I'm just like, all the surveys that I read are saying that even young kids that grow up in a digital age, they want to get away from it, right? Like as long as their parents are spoon-feeding devices to them, they're going to consume it. And the irony is that they want a worship time to get away from it. And what are our preachers doing? They're handing them, right, the digital stuff again, and they're making these, fancy sermons. So anyway, and I'm not against using technology. Certainly we use it, and but it's not a crutch, right? I'm not really into like using video clips in sermons, and but maybe that's a personal thing. Anyway, all of that to say, we are changing rapidly, and with when COVID hit, churches were forced to go online. A lot of us were really forced to go online, or else not meet and not have any interaction with each other. And so that kind of forced us into this digital culture where we already have people that are really hooked on the digital era. And so what do we do about that? Because I think that can really become our focus. And for a lot of churches, that is becoming the focus. And it's all about media and technology. And, and some churches, like I have to admit, sometimes I get a little bit envious at some of the cool videos. Like you land on their website and they just have these really awesome videos. And, it's sparkly and it's nice. But then I think some of these churches have all of that stuff, but they're a mess. And so I go back to, with this class, I go back to also, what was Jesus doing throughout his ministry? Now, obviously, they didn't have this technology, so that wasn't an issue. But there were other distractions that they had. And in the religious community, you see how Jesus was positioned towards them. The religious community was focused on all kinds of things that they thought was relevant for their day. And so Jesus, very interestingly, didn't spend his time really focusing on correcting that kind of mentality. He just went out and did what was right. And I still, I love your saying, do what's right always. I mean, if we as Christians just do what's right and focus on that, I feel like the church would really have a solid ground to stand on. And right now, this is just on the forefront of all of our minds. Churches are standing the test of time right now because of COVID and because of the political climate that we're in right now, where people are they're at each other's throats and families are splitting over their political affiliation. I mean, literally, families are dividing over this. Churches are dividing over political affiliation. And so this class, I feel like, is really relevant because we're living in these times. And churches are closing their door. I mean, we had this discussion on Wednesday night. We're finding out how well equipped we really are as Christians right now. Yeah, that was the question. Were we made for this? Obviously, God knew this was going to happen. He knew there was going to be a worldwide pandemic. And so the question is, how do we remain relevant as a church when things are changing around us so quickly? Should there be a revolution? Obviously, the thought of a political revolution isn't really well favored right now by many people, right? What happened at the Capitol, I don't think there are many people celebrating what happened at the Capitol. I don't think many people are like, yeah, that was a great idea, storm the Capitol. I haven't heard any of my friends, regardless of political affiliation or religious affiliation or no affiliation, I haven't heard any of my friends be like, that was awesome, So, where do we stand? What do we do as Christians? And people obviously are so frustrated right now. There's so much, like the time is ripe for so much toxic explosion. People are pent up. People are frustrated. People are financially strapped. People are tired of being locked up in their homes. Businesses are tired of being told that they can't do business. People are frustrated right now. So where's the church in all of this? Do we join those voices and be like, screw the government, like that's not really helpful. So what do we do? In the first century, and I want to go back, and I really want to dig into the scriptures. In the first century, there was this toxic environment, much like today, different circumstances, but much like today. The oppression from the Roman government, just the leaders that were positioning themselves, and they would come into these a lot of them Jewish cities, and would completely just take over them and Romanize these cities. The very first thing that they would do, they would put up a temple to the Roman gods and goddesses in that city. That was like the center of all activity in that city. So every city, these Roman temples would go up. For the archaeology class that we just finished, we talked a lot about how the Roman Empire they just came in and basically took the whole world over. It affected every single believer in a major way. And that was what Jesus was born into. Jesus was born, and Jesus' family fled. Our Savior was living in hiding in Egypt. You can't get much more explosive than that. So what did Jesus do? Did he get on a platform and say, down with the Roman government, we need to have a takeover? And trust me when I say this, a lot of Jewish people were doing that. They wanted to take the government by storm. That's what really led to the siege of Jerusalem in 70, the destruction of the temple. There were rebels who they wanted to take over the Roman government, and Rome came in and they just squashed Jerusalem. They burnt the temple. They burnt basically half the city to the ground. So what was Jesus doing during this volatile time? I think about, and this is just me personally, but when I grew up, I was like in this mentality that my job as a Christian was to make sure that we had the proper structure of worship, that on Sunday morning things went smoothly and went right. Like that was my job and duty as a Christian. Because we put so much focus on what happens on Sunday morning. And we weren't really equipping each other for living like Jesus. And so what was Jesus doing? We're going to look at John chapter 6. We have this on the screen here. The feeding of the 5,000. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. It's a lake. They called it a sea. It's a freshwater lake. 6 miles across, 11 miles top to bottom. It's not a huge lake, the Sea of Galilee. Luke records that the crowds were pressing in so hard on Jesus and his disciples that Jesus said, let's retreat to a desolate place. Let's get away. We need to rest. We need to eat. I don't remember if it's Mark or Luke says that there were so many people pressed against them that they didn't have any leisure to eat or sleep. They couldn't even eat because these crowds were so desperate for healing. So this is why they're going to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, is to just find a lonely place to just get away, retreat, get away from the crowds, and find rest. Verse 2, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that all these people may eat? This is the feeding of the 5,000. There were many more thousands of people. Some accounts say 5,000 men, not including women and children. You're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Not very desolate, is it? Not very lonely, is it? Not a good way to start your journey of rest and recovery. Verse 5, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? Can you imagine? I know what I spent on food last night with just Natalie and I. And we had a 20-minute conversation about whether to cook food at home and have a date. We didn't have our kids. They were all dispersed, different friends' houses. That doesn't happen often, so we wanted to take advantage of date time because that does not happen often. And we had this big 20-minute discussion because, yeah, do you spend $40 on food? I mean, not to be gross, but food in, food out, right? That's money that when you plop that money down, it's gone, and it's not coming back. So do we eat at home? Do we go to the effort and energy to cook a meal at home, where we always are stuck at? Or do we do date night in a restaurant? We chose a restaurant after 20 minutes of deliberation. So can you imagine thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and the Messiah points to you and says, all right, where are we going to go to buy food for all these people? Can you imagine? And John says he said this to test him, for he himself knew what we would do. Let me pause for a second. What's the point of this? Or what are the points of this passage? What are some takeaways from this?
Well, like it says, Jesus already knew what he was going to do.
Yeah.
How much did they believe that he could do that?
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge takeaway. One, I mean, even today, God knows what he's doing. The question is, do we believe it? And I feel like as the church, and trust me, I'm guilty of this. I get deflated so often, and I'm like, I look at what I think is the big picture, and I'm like, we're doomed. This year's been hard. I mean, last year, the last 365 days has been tough. I know. It's been rough, right? I mean, we ended 2020 with our beloved brother Bill passing away. if that wasn't a kick in the gut at a time when we're just, I mean, it's like, God, can you give us any more problem? I know you can give us a lot more, but I mean, rhetorically, I'm asking, can you give us any more problem in the midst of problems? And that's just one of 100 problems that we're facing as a small congregation with the chronic health issues. And, people just struggling right now in this little small body of believers. And so we look at that and we start to hyperventilate and get anxiety, and our blood pressure goes up, and we're like, oh my goodness, in a year, if this keeps up this pace, like, we're in big trouble. Here you have thousands of people who are in much worse shape than we've ever been as a body of believers. As a small congregation, this group of people, massive group of people, had infirmities, they had poverty like you wouldn't believe, they had struggles, they had isolation issues. Think about the cleanliness, the requirements for Jewish people. If you had these sicknesses, if you were oozing or bleeding, or you had impurities, you weren't allowed to associate with other people. You weren't allowed to be around them because you would make them unclean. People living in isolation, people living alone, people desperate, people hungry. They can't get a job because they make people unclean. You can't be around people. You're unemployed. You're poor. You're hungry. You're dirty. You're tired. You're sick. You can't afford doctors. I mean, every compound problem this group had, Jesus turns to Philip and says, okay, how are you going to get them food? And I don't think it was like a casual, let's sit down, let's figure out whether we have enough money to eat at a restaurant and have a wonderful date. Like, these people are crying out. They're hungry. Have you ever seen poverty where people are starving? I mean, I still remember, Dave, I don't know if you remember that, if you remember the conversation Mary Ann had with that woman who was so anemic. And Mary Ann was like, if you could even eat 2 eggs a day, that would do so much to help restore your health. And speaking through a translator, and I will never forget this young woman's, she was like in her early 20s. I mean, just so anemic. And I remember she said through the translator back to Mary Ann, she's like, I could never afford that. 2 eggs a day. I mean, this is extreme poverty. And Jesus says to Philip, all right, where are you going to buy food? So that's a huge takeaway. God knew what he was going to do with these people. God provides. That's not a cliche. God really does provide for people. Do we believe it?
Jimmy, you asked the question, like, why did he ask him that when he knew what he was going to do, right?
Yeah.
I was trying to think through that. I would assume that's because he was trying to get them to change their way of thinking. Like, because I think about it. If someone asks you that question, even with Jesus being there, at that point, they were going to say, it would immediately go, well, how are you going to get that much food? Where are you going to do that? How's that going to work?
And where are we going to get the money?
So,
yeah, right.
Where are you going to get it? So that would be the initial response. And then, here's the thing, though. That doesn't basically the same thing happen again? Where he asks them, and they say, well, where are we going to get it?
Yeah.
So the first time you would answer the same way they did. Like, where are you going to get it?
Right.
Why did they answer the same way the second time?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, just my feeling, I think even when Christ is right in front of us, we are so accustomed to thinking in boxes that we forget that God resides outside of any box that we could even dream of putting him in. And that God can and will do huge things if we have the faith and actually believe it. Jesus often said things like this, pray pray for whatever it is you're praying for and believe that you have already received it. You know, like Jesus is telling us to reframe the way that we pray. And I've talked about this before quite a bit. You know, if you listen to our language in prayer, and I still wrestle with this, it's that lack of confidence in praying. And we're like, okay, God, you know, please, if it's your will, heal this person. But if you don't, like, we totally get that, you know, God, and, you know, we have faith and we believe. And we're, you know, like, we're praying these prayers with all these different exceptions to it and caveats. And, you know, and we're like, okay, God, you know, like, I mean, I'll be completely transparent. I prayed for this congregation. And I really struggle to believe that God is doing something fantastic and great and huge and marvelous with his body of believers. And that's my fault. That's not God's fault.
Okay, now, you open the doors, and naturally I have to try.
Thank you, Charles. Oh, look at the time.
So allow me with the monkey and the wrench to come in.
Mm-hmm.
So, you say God will provide. We like to say that it's a really good, I'm going to get in trouble now. It's a really nice religious saying.
Yeah.
So, I'm just going to jump to a couple of instances, okay? And then I'm going to throw it on your shoulders.
Oh, thanks.
I'm here for it. So, we find Isaiah the prophet,
Mm-hmm.
sawn in half. God
Yeah.
provides. We have Lazarus outside the rich man's house who starves to death.
Yeah.
God provides. So, Jimmy, if you just believe, and Lazarus apparently is a righteous fellow, even though he's dying of hunger, and by the way, around the world, how many true believers in God are dying from starvation?
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, realistically, a lot.
We'll get really personal now. Young 6-year-old girl here last year, I believe it was. It may have been 2 years, but I think it was last year. We prayed for her health and she died anyway.
Yeah.
So, in the context of God provides, please explain.
Yeah. Oh, man, time's up. I guess we'll have to cover this next week. No, I mean, yeah, it's a great point, and I think Philip, being with Jesus and seeing people die, and hearing Jesus say over and over and over, don't worry about, look at the lilies of the field, and how wonderfully woven they are. And, you know, if God cares for the lilies like this, will God not provide clothing for his people? Right? Like, Jesus is constantly saying these things, and his disciples are witnessing people die. And they're witnessing people starve. And they're witnessing people be persecuted. And so, I mean, my takeaway from that is, and I could be completely wrong, is that Jesus is not clichéing them and saying that all people everywhere are going to be well provided for if all they do is just believe. Clearly, we see people dying on Jesus' watch. I mean, God in the flesh has people dying around him, starving to death, dying from illnesses. What I see Jesus consistently doing is when he sees a need that's in front of him, always, he takes care of those people.
So this
And,
brings us to the point of prayer.
yeah,
So if, and I'm going to really bend and twist here a lot. No stoning, please. I'm allergic to that. So if we're praying to God, are we then not in front of him at that moment? 1, 2, is it possible when we look at how we pray today, it's in response to what we've seen when we pray?
Yeah, I do. You know, I think one of the I'm trying to think through this in a way that's going to make sense, and not sound like I'm pandering or avoiding. No, it's good though, because this is life. Like, this is reality. We have so many struggles within our small congregation. I mean, that's the elephant is in the room, right? Like, we've had chronic health issues with so many people, depression issues, anxiety issues, poverty issues in this small congregation. And so I guess one of the things is what specifically are we praying for? 1, and 2, what are we doing about it? Because I don't ever see Jesus climb up on a mountain, pray that God just brings this blanket of healing and protection and food and clothing, and that God provides for all these people, and then Jesus is like, well, my job is done. What I see Jesus doing consistently is praying for more workers, is healing the people who are right in front of him, even when it ticked people off to the point where they wanted to murder him. Jesus unapologetically stepped into the lives of people who were hurting right in front of him. Not beyond that, or at least not very often. Sometimes he would say, well, save the trip, your child as well, right? But that was the exception. That wasn't the rule. The rule was, when Jesus saw somebody hurting in front of him, he reached out and he healed them and he blessed them. Yes?
I think, for me, when I look at God, Jesus providing, and a lot of times we look at the physical. We see physical here with bread, fish, food. But when we look through Scripture and we look outside our doors, as Charles said, there are many true believers that have faith, I'm sure a lot stronger.
Yeah.
That are suffering, that are dying, that are starving. And I think of the scripture where God tells us not to fear the one who can kill the body, but the one who can cast it into hell.
Yeah.
So when I look at God providing, I separate myself only because this is what makes me, or helps me keep moving forward when we see this kind of stuff. That he provides a way as we become his servants. He provides that way to serve him, to go out and reap the field, right?
Yeah.
To speak, to share his love, to share who he is, to hope to others. And in boast, if we keep our eyes on the prize, as Paul tells us, he provides that way in the house that he built for us. So that gets me up, gets me going, and gets me through the day, because you can't help everybody. I cannot help everybody. And I look around and you see that suffering. And if I truly believe that the only thing God's doing is providing the material things we need, I think it takes away from me who God is and some of the things he told me through Scripture. And I'm personal. I'm
Yeah.
not talking to God personally. And that's again where I look at, he has provided a way for us to get to heaven through his Son, and he provides a way for us to serve him while we're here. And when we've done our job, and I look at Bill as that example, his time on earth was done. It hurt,
Yeah.
it's sad, but I rejoice that he kept his eye on the prize, and God provided for him a home in heaven.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. And, I'll close with this, and hopefully satisfy your answer somewhat. And, I have to kind of dig deep within my own faith and my own understanding. But I think that's a great point. At the end of this, Jesus did feed the 5,000. He physically fed them. And then what's the very next discourse that John records? People are coming back saying, give us more bread, give us more food, feed us, feed us, feed us. And he doesn't. He actually withholds the food that he easily could have provided for, and he turned that into a lesson to say, I am the bread of life. You need to feed on my word. You need to come. So there's that physical side that Jesus did take care of. And then he comes back and he addresses the spiritual side. And he says, like this food will keep you alive a little bit longer, but at some point our time is up. And that's a great point. With Bill he absolutely had his eyes on the prize. No question about it. And for whatever reason, when his time was up, his time was up. When our time is up, our time is up. We don't know when that's going to be. Any of us, none of us know when our time is up. The question is, did we keep our eyes fixed on the prize? And did we help others, not just physically? Did we help people physically to provide for their needs? But did we also provide for their spiritual needs? Did we point them in the direction of the cross? Because if we do one and not the other, we're missing the mark of what Jesus was doing and who he was. And so, people of faith are going to suffer. People of faith are going to starve. Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. Jesus was under no illusion that poverty was going to be eradicated. Right? We hear this a lot today. If we just give X amount of dollars and if everybody gives this amount, we could feed every mouth on planet Earth. Oh, no, we can't. It's impossible. There's always going to be poverty. There's always going to be corruption. There's always going to be governments that steal the food that's on its way, or destroy it or whatever. There's always going to be corruption. There's always going to be starvation. There's always going to be disease. There's always going to be poverty. So what did James say? Pure and undefiled religion is this. It's what? To look after the orphans and the widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world. If we care for the people who are in front of us, and maybe my prayer is wrong for this congregation, and that's why I'm struggling with it. My prayer shouldn't be, God, make this big, powerful, wonderful thing happen to this church. My prayer probably ought to be, God, help us to keep providing for each other. Help us to be selfless with our possessions and our time, and to be humble, and to do what's right always. And I think that's, it gives us a lot to think about, and to think about where our mind is and the things we spend our time on and expend our energy. And maybe we need to reframe and restructure a little bit in our own minds. All right, I'm going to stop there. We'll see you guys in a few minutes.